Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Never Mind the Dam Busters. We'd just like to say thanks to everybody for their amazing support and very kind comments about our interview with Tom Davidson in episode 3. I think everyone sort of fell in love with Tom, didn't they? They just absolutely loved him. We've had some fabulous feedback on social media, and I think everybody wants to go for a cup of coffee with Tom now, don't they? How's your week been, James?
Yeah, it's been good. I enjoyed the bank holiday. I went to Sussex, but I can't seem to escape the Second World War. When I was at Battle Abbey, there was a memorial to the Dunkirk big and little ships. And also when I went to the Smuggler's Adventure in Hastings, there was a carved image in the cliffs there of Churchill and Montgomery as well. I've also been reading Roland White's excellent book on the mosquito. So, yeah. What about yourself?
That's definitely on my list, the mosquito book. Well, I've just started volunteering at the North East Land, Sea and Air Museum in Sunderland. It used to be the old Sunderland Air Museum, and the wartime home of Fighter Command 607 Squadron, because yes, we did have fighter squadrons up in the northeast of England. It's an absolutely fantastic little museum. It's only small and it's run entirely by volunteers, but it's got all sorts of stuff in there. For example, it's got a Vulcan. It's got a whirlwind. It's got a tornado. It's got a Sea Harrier. It's got an Anson. It's just got all sorts of stuff. They've got a separate hangar which is dedicated to naval aviation. So, yeah, it's absolutely well worth a visit. I'm going back there tomorrow to have a really good rake around, and I absolutely can't wait. Apart from that, I've also been looking for Halifax bomber crash site up in the Scottish borders, up in Kielder in Northumberland. This aircraft crashed on a training mission in October 1944, and a lot of the wreckage is still there, but it's in such an absolutely remote spot. I mean, we trekked for ages trying to find it, completely off the beaten track. There are no paths. It's in forestry woodland. It's sort of on moorland. It's just really, really difficult to find, and the weather wasn't very good either, so in the end we gave up. We'll attempt it again in better weather, I think. Anyway, what are we going to be talking about today, James?
So we've got something very exciting lined up. This is the first episode of a two-part special on planning and carrying out a Bomber Command raid. So we wanted to focus on one of the less well-known raids. So we're looking at the raid on Wuppertal in Germany in the Ruhr Valley on the 29th of May 1943. In part 1, we're going to be looking at why Bomber Command was targeting the Ruhr Valley at this time and how targets were selected and how operations were planned at headquarters and then rolled out to the Bomber Command groups and squadrons. We're then going to discuss how that actually panned out at squadron level and focus on a couple of the crews who were rostered for the operation from 10 Squadron. In part 2, we're going to be examining the course of the raid from the perspective of the German civilians on the ground. That night, we'll also be talking about air defences and dealing with the issue of casualties and discussing some utterly horrific descriptions of what it was like to be on the receiving end of a bombing raid. We'll also be looking at the experience of the RAF crews who took part. So, Jane, do you want to explain why you've chosen this particular raid?
Yes, I have a sort of a personal connection to this raid, really. The Wuppertal raid of 29th of May 1943 is an operation that I've researched in great detail because it was the first operation that my great-uncle, Jack Clyde, and his crew, who called themselves Penny's Prangers, took part in. And it was also very nearly their last. It's not one of the most famous raids. People probably haven't particularly heard about it before, but it's very typical of the type of operations which Bomber Command were carrying out in this phase of the strategic bombing campaign against industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley. It's not particularly well known, but the impact was utterly horrific. As we'll discuss in part 2, around 3,400 people are believed to have perished in Wuppertal that night, many of them in the firestorm which ensued. So let's get back to basics. And James, can you briefly explain how Bomber Command selected targets and why this particular corner of Germany was being so heavily targeted at this time in 1943?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing we've got to talk about is the Casablanca conference in January 1943. It's essentially deciding the direction of the war. Churchill and Roosevelt are there. Stalin can't make it. Let's face it, it's just after the Battle of Stalingrad. He's got a lot going on. And one of the things, for example, is the disposition of forces. And probably the biggest thing that comes out of it is the notion of the unconditional surrender when it comes to the Axis forces. So in June 1943, you then have the point blank directive. And this is all about destroying the Luftwaffe. It's the German Air Force, for those casual viewers who might not know. And this is in preparation for a land liberation of Northwest Europe, which becomes Operation Overlord, D-Day, as we are more familiar with saying. And a massive part of that, as well as destroying the Luftwaffe, is the industry. It's about destroying those fighters, those bombers, before they get off the ground. And one of the biggest areas of Germany that is full of factories and full of these areas that are building these aircraft and these engines and everything is the Ruhr Valley. So I talk about the west of Germany, right on the edge. And this is where what is dubbed by Harris the Battle of the Ruhr takes place. And this goes on between March 43 and includes the dams raids. Am I allowed to say that, Jane?
You are allowed to say that. It's very important, yes.
It's very important, but it's a part of a bigger operation. It's part of a bigger campaign that is going on. So
always
areas,
a bigger picture. Yeah, always a bigger
there
picture.
is absolutely, yeah. So when we look at this, we're looking at areas. The Krupp's work at Essen, for example, is an area that is bombed constantly. It's really a massive focus of Bomber Command. It's a massive key target, but included in there is what we're going to be talking about, Wuppertal.
Yeah. So you basically got places like Frankfurt, Dusseldorf, Essen that we've touched on, and Wuppertal, all these industrial towns. Someone once described this area as basically like, if you imagined sort of the industrial areas of northeast England, so Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough, but then add on Liverpool, add on Sheffield, add on Manchester. This is the sort of concentration of towns, population and industry that we're looking at. One of the best descriptions I ever heard of it was being described as the weapons smithy of the Third Reich. And I like that because there's so much armament production going on. We're not just talking about aircraft here, we're talking about all sorts of armaments being produced, all sorts of military supplies. So it's absolutely crucial to the German war effort. I hate the expression Nazi war machine, but basically, yeah, that's what's going on here. That's what it is. Yeah. So once the targets had been selected, it obviously had to be notified by Bomber Command headquarters to the various bomber groups taking part. The group headquarters would then notify the individual squadrons who were sort of lined up to take part in that particular raid that evening. It wasn't just a question of telling the squadrons, oh, you're flying to Wuppertal tonight. There was a massive effort behind the scenes. So at Bomber Command headquarters, the navigation and meteorology teams would be getting involved. So they are busy planning out routes. They are looking at the incoming weather forecasts. Many an operation got scrubbed just before takeoff because the weather was too bad. Because remember, they don't have the sort of technology that we have now to predict weather patterns, etc. Everything was weather dependent. They would also be looking at intelligence on anticipated opposition and enemy air defences. They would be calculating routes, calculating bomb loads, fuel loads. How much fuel does a Lancaster with a full bomb load need to get to Wuppertal and back to, say, Lincolnshire somewhere? How many aircraft are going to be needed to take part? In this particular raid, 719 aircraft were rostered. That's a huge number, isn't it? 719. That's absolutely massive. And to just break that down a little bit so you can see the types of aircraft involved, we've got 292 Lancasters, 185 Halifaxes, 118 Stirlings, 113 Wellingtons, and 11 Mosquitoes. So just about every type of aircraft that Bomber Command is flying at that point in time is taking part. It's not just all about Lancasters and Halifaxes. I think that's really important to remember. So James, what does this actually look like at squadron level? They get the call through from headquarters, from group, that the raid is on. What then kicks off at the base?
Well, this is an ongoing thing, really, and I mean, you could link part 1 and 2 and have it on a continuous loop for a few years, and that is essentially what Bomber Command were doing. So you have the aircraft being prepped, and that might be the night before you're repairing these bombers, you're making sure they're fit for service and such like. So you'd have the RAF fitters. Fitter is looking at the engines, and it's the same with Fighter Command and Coastal Command. That is what fitter means. And they worked around the clock. Shout out to our previous pod with Dan Ellen, talk about the ground crew. All weather conditions. They are out there working hard, trying to make these aircraft fly, and they couldn't fly without them. Now, one thing that I came across was to change an engine on a Lancaster. Sorry, Jane. I'm not sure about the statistics on the Halifax. It would take 5 hours, whereas today it would take about a week.
I say that doesn't sound very long at all. Yeah.
5 hours is insane. It really, really is.
That's Formula One sort of level, isn't it?
That's the thing is, it's exactly that. It is this around the clock trying to get these aircraft up as soon as possible. It is a Formula One situation where they land. Okay, let's check it out. Let's see where the holes are. Let's see where the engine is failing. Let's get it up as soon as possible, because the next night it's going to be flown either by the same crew or another crew. It's constant. And this is the thing. We're talking about Casablanca and Point Blank. The round-the-clock bombing is a phrase that comes out of this. That's exactly what it is. And that includes the people on the ground making sure that these bombers can take off and do the job that they're designed to do. But we say that there are other trades when it comes to this. So there are various types of mechanics, including radio. And there's also... things like cooks and butchers, obviously on the ground, we've talked about. But I want to just focus on a source that I've come across, the ABC of the RAF by Sir John Hamerton. And this is about an electrician as a trade on a bombing airfield. So this is the description. A handyman about the house repairing electric irons or radiators may be able to serve as an electrician in the Royal Air Force. Would-be electricians should be between the ages of 18 and 38 and should preferably have a certain amount of knowledge in the elementary theory of electricity, such as a clear knowledge of OHM's law and of the full meaning of EMF. An applicant of the right type without electrical knowledge would also be considered. The electrician joins the service with similar conditions of pay to the flight mechanic. He may also undergo a conversion course to become an electrician. Most of his work will be done in aircraft on the ground, but like the flight mechanic and repairer and armourer, he may be required to fly to test the aircraft and the efficiency of his work. I think that's incredible.
That's quite a risky thing to be doing as well, isn't it? Really, when you think about it. You're not trained aircrew, but you're still expected to go up and sort of test the electrics on the aircraft and what have you. What if they're not working? Yeah. That's quite a big ask.
Well, as I said, at the start of the war, the mechanics and riggers and such like armourers would often act as gunners.
Yeah.
The role of gunner wasn't a trained role. It's just incredible, really, isn't it, when you think about it?
Yeah. We touched on that on episode 2, didn't we? Now, we've also got,
we do,
as well as the electricians, we've got the armourers. So they are basically fitting the bombs into the aircraft.
And the guns,
And the guns, making sure that all the ammunition, etc. there. You've got the guys in the fuel tanks, filling up the fuel on the aircraft. They were probably among the first people on the base to actually know or be able to work out what the target was going to be simply by the amount of fuel that they were requested to put on board each aircraft. Yeah. And likewise, the WAFs and the map stores as well. They're going to be told, get your maps out for the Ruhr Valley tonight, so there will be an inkling certainly on the base as to where they were going, but the actual target would not be revealed till much later on. So then we're looking at 10 Squadron, as we briefly mentioned at the beginning. I'm going to introduce you now to two 10 Squadron crews who are going to be taking part in this raid on Wuppertal on the night of the 29th of May. So in Yorker, at Halifax, code symbol Y, we've got the crew of Reg Pennicott. Now, they called themselves Penny's Prangers for obvious reasons, and everyone in the crew called the skipper Pennicott Penny for short. We've got navigator Roy Tan. We've got bomb aimer Ken Cox. We've got wireless operator Jack Clyde, my uncle. Mid-upper gunner Freddie Singh. Tail gunner Bill Bradshaw. And flight engineer George Phillipson. Also taking part in the raid that evening, we've got 27-year-old New Zealander Flight Sergeant John Clarke in S Sugar, with his British crew James Birrell from Scotland, Jasper Cranham, Bob Harris, John Pickles, John Saunders and Bob Scott. And the average age of this crew was 22, which is about par for the course. Now, both of these skippers had flown 2 previous operations on the preceding week as second pilots, just to give them a taster session, if you like. It's a particularly horrific sort of work experience. And they'd taken part in a raid on Dortmund just a few days before. The squadron had lost 3 of the 21 aircraft sent out that night, including some carrying other second pilots out on their sort of first experience mission, if you like. That's a loss rate of over 11%, which is absolutely massive. However, this Wuppertal raid, the raid that we're talking about, is the first operation where these 2 skippers are in command of their own crew and aircraft, and for their crews, it's their very first operation. So what would they be doing that day? Well, at this particular point in time, I briefly touched upon the losses that the squadron is suffering. This squadron, like many others in 4 Group, are taking an absolute battering. It was perfectly normal for them to lose at least 1 crew per operation, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single night. We've got 17 crews rostered for the Wuppertal operation on this particular evening. Many of those crews were very, very experienced, but these 2 particular crews, as I've mentioned, this was their first op, so they had no idea what to actually expect. It's one of the things which I kind of thought about. The 2 pilots have both been on 2 sort of taster operations, if you like. What do they actually tell their crew? Or what did they say to them? I mean, were they sort of realistic about it and said, my God, this is absolutely horrific? Or did they kind of play it down and try and jolly them along and say, oh, no, it's nothing to be scared of or whatever? How would you even cope with that? You know, I mean, these guys are just their mid-20s. How do you take on that level of responsibility and try and, inspire confidence in your crew, knowing full well what actually lies ahead? It's just unbelievable, isn't it?
We say mid-20s. I mean, pilots that were 25, 26 years old were old men.
Yeah.
They were called that. It was, I mean, pilots were slightly older, so you're looking at about 20 years old. But air gunners could be 18, 19 years old.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's just...
Most of the lads in Pennicott's crew
18, 19, yeah.
Yeah. Most of the lads in the Pennicott crew were 20, 21, 22. And the pilot, Penny, I think he was 26 at the time. So, he was a bit older. But, yeah, just that responsibility. It's just... It's absolutely mind-blowing, isn't it? Incredible.
It's crazy, yeah.
So during the course of the day, even if you are flying on operations on an evening, you would still potentially be up doing air tests and stuff during the day. You'd be carrying out exercises. Things didn't stop just because you're on operation. It's just this constant activity on the bases, as we've touched on, literally going around the clock. But for the crews, they would only find out for certain where they were going at the crew briefing. Absolutely. So the first time that the crew would find out where they were actually going on their operation that night would be in the briefing hall. So you've all seen the briefing hall scenes in films such as the Dam Busters, Target for Tonight, appointment in London, etc., when all the crews are gathered together in usually a sort of large Nissen hut with rows and rows of chairs. There's usually a big sort of screen or notice board at the end of the hall covered in a curtain, and the intelligence officer or CEO would normally walk in, begin the meeting and uncover the board and show where the target was for that particular night. And the route would be usually marked in on sort of red thread or wool or whatever, to show the potential route that the crews will be taking. Now, security in the briefing halls was absolutely rigid. Once all of the men were inside for the briefing, the doors were actually locked and armed guards were posted outside. The windows, blinds would be pulled down so that nobody outside of that hall would know where the target was. Security was everything. So on this particular night, our crews all file in. We've got 17 crews rostered for the Wuppertal operation, including those of Clarke and Pennicott. They take their seats, and the senior officer then reveals the target as Wuppertal. Now, obviously, many of the men in that room had been to the Ruhr Valley on several occasions previously, some more than several occasions, and one can just imagine there being an almost audible groan when they discovered that they were going back to the Ruhr Valley. Obviously, for the crews of Clarke and Pennicott, they'd heard all about the Ruhr Valley, but really had no idea what to expect and what they were really letting themselves in for. So they were explained where they were targeting. They were given their specific coordinates. The navigators would be issued with their particular instructions and given their maps from the map room, the WAFs in the map room. And then they would go away and prepare everything that they needed to do. The bomb aimers would be carrying out their calculations with regard to their bomb loads and their run-in, etc. It's a very, very complicated operation, and everybody has got a vital role to play. It's not just simply a question of getting in your aircraft, flying over to the target, drop your bombs and coming home again. It's an extremely complicated operation. So the crew know that they are going to Wuppertal. They know that they are going to be targeting the industrial areas of Wuppertal, but also the city centre itself. Now, over at 76 Squadron at RAF Linton-on-Ouse, another squadron in 4 group, the crew at that briefing are told by the intelligence officer that there are a number of refugees flooding into Wuppertal from other towns which have been bombed in the area, and that the intention is to catch, I'll use that word loosely, catch the refugees who are coming in from other cities. What that meant was basically being told that they were going to have to kill these people, as many of them as possible. This is not something which appears to have been mentioned at any of the other briefings for this particular operation. So whether it was just bluff and bluster on the part of the intelligence officer delivering the speech, we just don't know. But it certainly caused a great deal of disquiet among the crews at 76 Squadron, and a lot of them sort of voiced some disagreement that basically this wasn't what they joined the RAF for, to target civilians. But ultimately, as matters panned out, that's exactly what they would be doing as part of the combined bomber offensive, strategic bombing. That's what it does. And that's something that we'll be looking at in a lot more detail in the next operation. So once the briefing has taken place and the guys know where they're going and that they've got their maps, they've got all their gear, they then go out to the changing rooms to get kitted up after they've had their operational supper, of course, always eggs and bacon, allegedly. They then go to get changed into their flying suits, their flying gear. All their personal possessions and clothes are put into individual sacks, and then each crew has one big sack in which everyone's smaller sacks are deposited, and they are then put in a locker for safekeeping. The reason for that is if they don't come back, it makes it just easier to find all their possessions. That's pretty sobering, isn't it? So they then be hanging around, always a bit of hanging around. They'll be standing outside waiting for the trucks to come to take them along to their aircraft, which could be, I mean, these bases are massive. You could be a mile away, sometimes more, where the aircraft are situated well away from the sort of accommodation and admin blocks. So you can imagine them just all standing around outside, having a quick smoke or whatever, chatting, laughing, gallows humour, no doubt, among a lot of them. As far as the Pennicott crew was concerned, Jack, the wireless operator, was related by marriage to one of the ground crew on the site, Leo Grock, who we met in one of our earlier episodes. Leo was ground crew at Urk, and before every operation, Jack would give his keys, his house keys, to Leo to give to his sister in case he didn't come back. And Leo absolutely hated this responsibility. And as you can imagine, he was absolutely on bricks the whole time that Jack was airborne, dreading the possibility that he might have to go and take the keys home to his sister-in-law Lydia if Jack didn't come back. So that's just a little sort of human aspect, if you like. Now, as regards nerves, every man is different. You've got to be nervous. You can't not be nervous. I mean, those who had been on raids previously must have been absolutely terrified. I remember speaking to Doug Newham, who was the navigation leader at 10 Squadron, and Doug, who only passed away a couple of years ago, told me that the nervous tension was so great before a raid that he often had to get back out of the aircraft and throw up in the nearest hedge before they took off. And this was a very, very experienced guy. Maybe that's why he felt that way, because he'd been through all of that. But you just can't even begin to imagine, can you, what that must have felt like?
Well, the thing that I come across is that they'll talk immediately before a mission is that they'll talk about anything but the raid or the job ahead. It'll be kind of like, oh, that girl Sally at the Dog and Pheasant, I kind of fancy her. Do you fancy her, really? She's as ugly as a whatever.
Yeah.
You know, the young guys. And I mean, I couldn't imagine the anxiety and nerves before that mission, and you would focus on the job in hand, wouldn't you? I mean, it's just, I can't begin to imagine it.
Yeah. I mean, for some of them who are going on their first stop, there's also got to be an element of perhaps excitement and anticipation there as well, because, they think, oh yeah, I'm finally getting to do my bit, finally give Hitler a bloody nose and all this kind of thing, because they have until you're actually up there and flying over the target and all hell breaks loose around you, you have no comprehension as to what you're getting into. This is something which I discussed it in my last book. It's what's worse, knowing what to expect, having done it before, or not knowing. It's equally as bad, I think. It's just, I just can't get my head around that.
Yeah. But there's a reason why the highest losses are at the start of a tour and at the end of the tour. The start of the tour is the inexperience and the gung-ho-ness. And then at the end of the tour, it's the, we've nearly made it. Oh, gosh, we need to be a little bit more careful and such like.
Yeah. I think you had something like a 20% chance of surviving your first 5 ops at this time. Some ridiculous statistic like that. Yeah. That's insane, isn't it? It's just, I just can't comprehend that. So,
but the other thing was you had this attitude, that I've come across is just like, well, we're going to make it. It's going to happen to the other fella. I think I've said that before. It's just.
Well, when you're 19, 20, 21.
Climb into that bomber without thinking that. Yeah, absolutely.
You think you're immortal at that age, don't you? I mean, we all do. When you're sort of late teens, early 20s. Yeah. Won't happen to me. What can possibly go wrong?
I'm sure they were terrified of chatting to girls in a Lincoln pub, but quite happy to jump into a Lancaster. Yeah, I can kind of relate to that. I'd happily jump into a Lancaster than chat to a girl and try. I don't know. That's me being very, very silly, but
No, it's not
there
though,
is this
because
sort of
because I mean, Jack, for example, he was really, really shy. And the thought, as you said, of going talking to a group of girls in a pub in Lincoln or York or wherever, he would have just hated that. But yeah, there he is, 19, 20-year-old climbing up into his Halifax, about to, fly over the Ruhr Valley. But yeah.
That's what you like at that age, isn't it? You just like, I don't know, your sense of the world and understanding is just, it's not been built, has it?
No. I mean, naive, innocent, but also just incredibly brave. I know they don't think of themselves as brave. They don't. They say, we were just doing a job. But to us, remember, these guys are all volunteers as well. They haven't been conscripted for this. They've all volunteered for this duty. And it just, I just can't get my head around it. Anyway, so...
And there's the other thing, would you say, there's a vigorous process of actually getting into that position of being an air gunner or being a wireless operator or a pilot. It's not just anybody that can sit in that. You volunteer.
No, right.
Automatically you're selected. There is a vigorous process.
So going back to the night in question then, the guys are picked up in the trucks, usually or often driven by WAAFs, and then driven out to their individual aircraft. They're all giving a running order, and the aircraft are all sort of lined up around the perimeter and in the order that they will be taking off. The Pennicott crew in Yorker are told that they will be taking off at 11 p.m. on the dot. Flight Sergeant Clarke and his crew in Sugar are directly behind them, and they'll be taking off 2 minutes later. So when they get on board then, the first thing that they do is they'll probably be on board about half an hour before they're due to take off, and then they're doing sort of all their checks, aren't they? And the ground crews are still sort of buzzing around doing bits and pieces, aren't they, at this point? It's
about an hour,
yeah. So they'll be sort of doing various tests, testing the hydraulics, testing the ammunition belts, doing sort of running the engines, all sorts of stuff. The flight engineer is particularly busy at this point in time. So Tom, who we met last week in the last episode, he would be busy checking fuel levels, checking hydraulic fluid, checking basically everything, making sure that the aircraft is fit to take off. The bomb aimer would be sitting there going over his calculations and everything again, and the navigator will be checking and rechecking his route and communicating that information to the pilot. They'll be testing the onboard intercoms, and the wireless operator will be testing all his equipment, making sure all the radio and everything is functioning properly, and also checking that the pigeons are on board. Don't forget about the pigeons. I think we mentioned pigeons in a previous episode. If not, we'll certainly mention them next time. Make sure that the 2 pigeons are all right and safely stowed. And then just waiting for their takeoff time. So there we are then. Our crews are all aboard their aircraft, just awaiting the signal to take off. Next time, we'll be looking at what happened when the operation actually got underway, both for the men on board and for the people of Wuppertal. Now, we do have some questions to answer this week, so thank you very much for sending those in. We're just going to be dealing with one per episode, we've decided, because it takes us so long to answer just even one question. So our first question then is from Ian F. on Twitter, X. How much collaboration was there with the 8th Air Force on target selection? Now, this all goes back to what we've just been talking about Casablanca and Point Blank, doesn't it?
Well, you've got to go higher up and decide where the overall strategy and combined bomber. This is the thing that annoys me, actually, is when it comes to the Royal Air Force and the USAAF in wider memory, they're seen as just 2 air forces doing different things, and that was not the case. There was a sharing of technology, of ideas, and at the grander, wider level, they were trying to do the same thing. So we've mentioned Casablanca, we've mentioned Point Blank. It was about destroying the Luftwaffe. You know, that they can agree on that they can work on that. How they do that is then up to the individual commanders.
Yeah. That's why it's called the Combined Bomber Offensive, because it was both air forces combined, basically working towards the same goal.
It's kind of a giveaway in the title, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, they're both working towards the same goal, but perhaps using slightly, well, that's arguable, but slightly different means and strategies. And I know there's one thing that really gets on your nerves, James, and this idea that Bomber Command only bombed by night and that the US Army Air Force only bombed by day. That's not true at all, is it?
Well, the USAAF, they did bomb by day, but the issue I have is that there's this indiscriminate bombing when it comes to Bomber Command. And actually what you find is with the USAAF is when their idea of using the Norden bomb site and of precision targets is put into practice, they're shot down out of the air and they miss their target. So actually what they end up moving towards is more of a area target doctrine. On the other hand, the Royal Air Force become more accurate.
Yeah. So they're kind of almost evening out, aren't they, sort of between them? They're all pretty much doing the same thing, but by the end of it, working in
it's
a
this thing when it
way.
comes to technology. You've got H2S, you've got H2X. They share it. This is a combined bombing offensive. Is a combined technology and intelligence aspect. They want to defeat Nazi Germany. They want to defeat the Axis. Of course, they're going to share things. Of course, they want to work together. They're not going to be separate rival. Yeah, you can say there's some bickering and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, they want to win. They want to get the war done. I think, this is probably more of a post-war thing.
Yeah, I think there's also this sort of argument that this, what the Americans called pickle barrel bombing, this sort of bombing to very, very precise targets, targeting industrial sites or whatever, that was more sort of in theory than reality. And I think a lot of that, it was sort of packaged up to make the whole concept of bombing more palatable to the American public, who were absolutely horrified and quite queasy at the concept of area bombing and dehousing that the RAF were adopting. But in effect, the reality of it, it's all pretty much the same thing.
It is, and you have the fallback bombing as well. So you might hit that industrial target, that factory or whatever, but not every bomber is. So you've got the lead bomber that's dropping the bombs. Okay, a few seconds later, a few seconds in the air, it's thousands of feet. It's a massive distance. So those bombs afterwards are falling on non-industrial areas, falling on houses and such like. Yeah. So to say it,
So it's sort of 1942, 43, early 44, the technology to be able to precision bomb to the sort of degree that people, I think, perhaps think they were capable of. It just didn't exist. You just couldn't do it. It just wasn't possible. And I think that there's been sort of a lot of mythology built up around that, and particularly about the Norden bomb site, hasn't there? It was meant to be, the be all and end all. Yes, it was fantastic, but you're always going to get creep back. Obviously the weather plays a big part as well. There are so many
that's
myriad
the thing
factors.
When the Norden bomb site is tested, it's in a desert in Arizona or wherever it is, where you're obviously, and without flak and fighters and all the other things that come with actually bombing a target, of course it's going to be reasonably accurate. But as soon as you're under flak and fighters and there's the fog of war and there's deceptions and all these sort of things going on, it really throws something else into the equation when it comes to hitting these targets. And the whole pickle barrel, wasn't it? It's just... Well, that's propaganda, isn't it?
It is. It's just propaganda to make it all more palatable for the American public, I think. But also,
and acceptable.
And acceptable. But it all amounts to the same thing. Civilians are going to die in their, as it turned out, hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
And that's something which we will be discussing in a great more detail next time, when we'll be talking about the reality of strategic bombing and what that actually means for people on the ground.
So I think we'll wrap up there. We've got so much to discuss, and I'm looking forward to part 2, looking at the sharp end of bombing raid. Special thanks has to go to our subscribers, and do please leave us a review. Do follow us on Twitter, X, Facebook, etc. And Jane, do you want to talk about next time?
Yes, so next time we'll be picking up exactly where we left off, with our crews at 10 Squadron about to take off and heading towards the Ruhr Valley and to Wuppertal. So then you can find out the fate of Penny's Prangers and Sugar. We'll be meeting some of the citizens of Wuppertal caught up in the raids, and we'll be dealing with the horrific reality of strategic bombing. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.